First structure we're looking at is the White Temple and Ziggurat. And there's a lot to explain here in terms of what exactly is going on. So when we look at the White Temple and Ziggurat, it would have looked, or today looks like this. Of course, it's made of mud brick. And so even in a place like modern day Iraq, there is enough rain that it will wear down that mud brick, especially over the span of about 5,000 years. I mean, we're 3,000 BCE. And this would have been central to the city. Now, this is not the same ziggurat, but it does give you an idea of its centrality. Think of downtown Milwaukee or Madison. Your major churches are there just like your museums, courthouses, government buildings, etc., marketplaces. And so they're going to place this ziggurat in the center of the city. It reflects the central role of religion in daily life, which is developing. Religion is becoming incredibly important as we move forward out of the prehistoric into this very early Western civilization. It has what's called a bent axis. In other words, the stairs do not lead directly to the temple, but require one to change direction. This indicates that there is a certain sacredness to the temple itself. And that's going to be important because at the end of the day, the temple at the top is the temple. The mound around it, what looks like a pyramid that the temple is sitting on, what's referred to as the ziggurat, is basically an artificial mountain. It exists for the purpose of elevating the temple closer to the gods and above all of the terrestrial material issues at street level. It's above the markets, the government, etc. It kind of makes sense from a metaphorical perspective. The corners face the four cardinal directions, meaning that they are aware of the four cardinal directions. How do they do this without a compass? Well, again, the favorite tool of the ancient man, a stick. Because you can work out those directions. As long as you know where the sun travels, you know that travels east to west, and bisecting that angle, you get north and south. So it's actually a lot easier than we would tend to think. And it's probably dedicated to the sky god. We assume this because, of course, it's elevated. This elevation idea, by the way, is not solely something that we see from the Mesopotamians. Almost every pyramid outside of Egypt is doing the same thing, where it's an artificial mound with a temple on top. It doesn't matter if it's Mesoamerica, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, etc. The Egyptians are a little bit different because they're burying someone in it. And while they are getting closer to the gods, it's not as such a temple so much as a tomb, whereas these are definitely not tombs. And by the way, the temple itself at the top of that ziggurat, just as with many of these others, is called a cella. C-E-L-L-A. We'll get to that in a second. And only the priests or the high priest could enter that space because that is seen as sort of a house of the god. The god can appear there. They don't necessarily live there all the time. And only the priests, the most cleansed of the people, can enter into that cella. Is made of mud brick, which we've talked about before. Basically, sun-dried mud with straw in it to give it additional strength. And the temple itself at the top would have been whitewashed. Why? Well, first of all, it looks clean and finished. And if you're creating something that is effectively a house to a god, you're going to want it to be as perfect as possible. Second reason, if you're in some place like Iraq, where it is very sunny, you're in the middle of the desert, then that white is going to gleam. It's going to be visible from many miles away. Just think of in Wisconsin when we have minus 20 weather the day after a snowstorm, and it almost hurts to go outside and look around, all that white gleaming back at you, and you would see pretty much the same thing here. At least that's the effect that they're looking for. Also, it denotes purity, which would be important in a temple. Now, the cella, which I talked about earlier, the actual temple, is only accessible to the priests. It's where the priests would go to speak to the god. I'm using god in a broad sense. Obviously, there could be a goddess too, like Inanna. And this is a chamber set aside specifically for deity. It's a term we're going to use from now all the way through the Greeks and the Romans, because they all use the same basic concept. It doesn't become a true church or anything along those lines until you get parishioners entering into it, which we don't see until much later in history. But this does lay the groundwork for everything from the Mesopotamians through the Greeks in terms of how temples function. And by the way, the average person could stand around at the base of the ziggurat. In some cases, may have been able to come up to a specific level if it's terraced, but they would have never, ever entered or looked into the Cella because the average person is not pure enough, is not cleansed enough to look upon the god.